It begins with a door of iron, blistered by time, groaning open beneath the weight of its own myth. The hinges weep with rust. A single torch flickers in the far alcove of the chamber, its flame bending as if afraid to speak too loud. Dust floats like old breath in the air, and all is silent, save for the quiet creak of the iron door as it swings open, revealing, at last, the Iron Maiden. She does not scream. She does not move. She stands, tall, narrow, terrible, with her arms folded inward like a mother offering embrace. But no warmth waits within. The spikes, faintly visible through the darkness inside her belly, gleam like the teeth of a wolf beneath a shroud. And yet, this is not history. This is theater. The narrator's voice descends, quiet and reverent. For centuries, she haunted imaginations, the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, sculpted into memory as one of the cruelest punishments devised by man. But the records are silent. The parchments of medieval courts, heavy with lists of sins and confessions, never speak her name. The maiden, as she is shown today, spiked, woman-shaped, built to pierce flesh and swallow agony, is a ghost of a later age, born not of dungeons, but of ink. It was the year 1793. The Enlightenment flickered like a candle in storm wind. Amid philosophy and revolution, a scholar named Johann Philipp Siebenkees wrote of a tale, one that would outlive him. He told of a coin forger in Nuremberg, dragged before magistrates and sentenced to die inside a maiden of iron. The doors shut, the spikes drove inward. Blood, he wrote, pooled beneath her feet. It was a story meant to shock, to moralize, but it was not drawn from the records of the city. It was drawn from the shadows. And yet the world believed. Soon, cabinets of curiosity across Europe demanded one. Blacksmiths and artisans scavenged old ironwork, shaped it like the Virgin, studded her inside with blades. By the 1800s, replicas of the Iron Maiden stood in museum halls from Vienna to London. Tourists leaned in with pale faces, imagining screams that had never echoed, pain that had never been inflicted, justice that had never been served. But the lie had weight. It fed on the bones of memory, and it dressed itself in the clothes of truth. People wanted to believe it, because they believed the Middle Ages were darker than they were. They believed the church hunted witches daily, that torturers worked in secret chambers beneath every castle. They believed that horror was history, so the maiden endured. Even as historians protested, pointing to the codes of medieval justice that outlined specific tools, regulated interrogation, forbade arbitrary cruelty, still she stood, in fairs, in films, in schoolbooks, and nightmares. She became an icon of medieval brutality, even as the real tools of pain, the rack, the scourge, the strappado, gathered dust in forgotten corners of museums. But tonight, in this chamber, she waits silently, like a mirror. The torchlight stutters, casting long, spiked shadows along the damp stone walls. She waits not for blood, but for understanding, because the truth of her myth is more telling than the myth itself. In the real Middle Ages, punishment was ritual. Confession was sacred. Torture, though real, was formal, used not for vengeance, but to compel truth in trials of heresy or treason. It was cold, procedural, laced with fear of damnation. The iron chair, the boot, the wheel, all were brutal, yes, but they were known, recorded, feared openly. The maiden was not. She belongs to the fever dreams of a world trying to make sense of its past. She is our projection, our nightmare of justice run amok. Her shape, womanly, is not accidental. She is mother and executioner. She promises embrace and delivers agony. In her, we see the betrayal of comfort, the womb turned coffin, the sacred turned profane. And perhaps that is why she lasts, because she is not about the Middle Ages at all. She is about us. The narrator's voice softens now. A single feather, black with soot, drifts from the rafters and lands on the stone floor beside the maiden. Outside, the wind moans through broken shutters. It smells of cold iron and wet leaves. Somewhere far off, a church bell tolls the hour, muffled by fog, and the maiden stands alone. She is a relic of fear, not from the past, but of the stories we choose to believe. She tells us more about our fascination with cruelty than about cruelty itself. She is a warning, not of what was, but of how myth can become truth when left unchallenged. There is no blood beneath her feet, no bones rest in her belly, but there are echoes, echoes of laughter in museum halls, echoes of schoolchildren wide-eyed in front of her, echoes of directors calling action in low-budget films, echoes of every whispered tale that began with, in the dark ages, they did unspeakable things, And yet, perhaps we can finally speak them. As the torchlight fades and the door begins to close again, we do not hear screams. We hear pages turning, the soft brush of a historian's hand as she traces the rivets on the maiden's back, the scribble of a scholar noting no record of use, no case of trial, a construct of legend. The maiden does not weep, she waits, and beyond her, through the doorway, deeper into the darkness, other shadows stir, real tools, real chains, real names etched in parchment. The true machinery of medieval pain awaits, less theatrical, more devastating. The torch is passed. We move forward, not toward myth but memory, toward the real stories, the real agonies, the real justice, and what it meant to survive them. Let us walk on. A bell rings in the distance, its voice cracked and hollow as though tolling not for the living, but for something long dead and improperly buried. A cold fog gathers over cobblestones, slick with dew, rising in spirals that cling to iron gates and stained glass. Behind those windows, the candlelight of a new century flickers, hungry not for truth, but for spectacle. This is not the Middle Ages. This is the birth of myth. In the drawing rooms of 19th century Europe, where velvet drapes silenced the world outside and parlors filled with cigar smoke and the clink of brandy glasses, the Middle Ages were being reborn, not as they were, but as they were needed to be. The Gothic revival, they called it, a renaissance of terror wrapped in romantic longing. And into this dreamlike fog walked the Iron Maiden, not from the blood-slick corridors of a medieval castle, but from the fevered ink of imagination. The voice of the narrator leans in. In these salons, men whispered of forgotten tortures, of masked inquisitors, of dungeons beneath cathedrals where screams were swallowed by stone. A hunger for the grotesque bloomed in ink-stained hands. Gothic novels, pulp histories, and sensational exhibitions pulled the Iron Maiden from nowhere and gave her form. Towering, feminine, and draped in rust, she became the icon of a past that had never quite existed. It was not scholars who brought her to life. It was showmen. We drift now to an exhibition hall in 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Among the fairground wonders and industrial marvels stood a grotesque monument, an iron sarcophagus lined with spikes, her surface inscribed with fake Latin, her joints rough with rivets cobbled together from older machinery. Visitors queued in silence, some shivering despite the heat. Some wept. Some turned away. But all believed. She was labeled the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg. No origin, no citation, just a city name, a myth, and the chill of her presence. Torchlight shimmers against her surface like candlelight on a casket. She looks like death made mother, and people paid to see her. We feel the creak of floorboards, the shuffle of shoes on oiled planks, the faint scent of iron mingling with perfume and sweat. In this moment, history was not being taught, it was being staged. The narrator slows, voice growing grave. The real Middle Ages, its dirt, its ritual, its measured cruelty, was buried beneath layers of performance. Beneath the awestruck gasps of 19th century crowds who wanted to believe that humanity had climbed out of darkness, that what came before was monstrous. And the maiden stood as proof. But she was no executioner's tool. She was no priest's instrument of confession. She was a mirror, crafted by industrial hands to show us not what was done, but what we feared we could become. We drift backwards now, before the wax exhibits and fairground lanterns, before Siebenke's chilling tale of the forger crushed in a virgin's embrace, before the salons of London and Berlin and Paris turned Middle Ages into midnight theater. We return to stone. The real dungeons of Nuremberg were damp and narrow. They reeked of mildew and urine. Interrogation was swift, brutal, but bound by civic law and church restriction. There were racks, ropes, waterboards, and flames, but always with paper to account for each act, and priests to weigh salvation against suffering. Cruel, yes, but not theatrical, never performative. There was no maiden in the ledger, no sarcophagus in the cellar. And still she came, because she was needed, not by jailers, but by mythmakers. She gave physical form to our longing for punishment, our guilt draped in iron. Her arms did not open to embrace, they opened to accuse. We hear a door slam, sharp, metallic. It echoes through an empty museum now. The maiden sits behind glass in modern halls, silent as bone. Her story has begun to unravel, and yet she endures. Perhaps we cannot let her go. She is too perfect a shape, too terrible a silence. Her spikes no longer threaten flesh, but understanding. Because if she is false, Then what else have we mistaken for memory? What else have we placed in history's hands that never truly lived? The torch dims again, casting her silhouette large against the wall. A child peers into the glass, her breath fogging the surface. Did they really use that? She asks. And somewhere, an archivist weeps. Because the Iron Maiden was never meant to be seen. She was meant to be believed. As the chapter closes, we step outside that exhibit. The air is thick with questions. The streets echo not with the screams of prisoners, but with the footfalls of tourists. Beneath their shoes, history sleeps restlessly, stirred by myth and soothed by memory. And deeper still, far beneath the stone, older stories whisper of other punishments, other sins, real tools, real fire, real sorrow. The Iron Maiden may be the lie, but the truth is waiting. Let us descend again. A man kneels on wet stone. Rain has slipped through the cracks in the ceiling, and now the floor glistens with puddles, dark as wine. The hem of his robe is soaked. A single candle guttering near the wall sputters its last breath. In his hand, a rosary, worn smooth by the rhythm of guilt and grace. Beads slide between fingers not with peace, but dread. He is not praying for forgiveness. He is praying that the Inquisitor forgets his name. This is not the torture chamber of cinema. This is the real edge of medieval justice. Cold, quiet, and waiting. Outside, bells toll prime. The day begins above ground with market carts and cathedral bells. But here below, the air does not move, and when it does, it smells of rust and rot and mold, the perfume of limbo. In the darkness, we expect to find her, the Iron Maiden. The steel-faced matron with her hidden nails, her false embrace, her chamber of slow agony. But she is not here. She was never here. She does not belong to this silence, because in truth, the pain here was different, sharper, simpler, real. The Middle Ages did not need myths. They had rope. They had fire. They had the rack. They had men who believed pain could pull truth from the throat like marrow from bone, and yet even these men feared the soul more than the body. Confession was salvation. A guilty mouth was a soul saved from eternal flame. And so torture was not cruelty, it was correction. The voice softens, cold and sorrowful. We must understand this world not as monsters, but as believers. The executioner prayed, the interrogator wept, the condemned often kissed the cross before the lash. Their cruelty was wrapped in absolution. A scream in this world was not entertainment, it was liturgy. It belonged to a sequence of rituals that stretched from courtroom to confessional to grave. And every part of it was recorded. Every wound signed and sealed with ecclesiastical approval. There were no Iron Maidens in these records. There were chains, there were branding irons, there was water poured into mouths held open by wooden gags, but there was no feminine coffin of spikes. Because that nightmare, that theater of blades, came later, built by the hands of men who misunderstood the darkness they so craved. The Iron Maiden is not a medieval object. She is a modern inheritance, and yet the belief in her runs deeper than the facts that disprove her. Why? Because she fulfills something we need, a symbol, of cruelty refined, of pain beautified. She is not a chair or a boot, she is a figure, a mother of death, arms outstretched, face of calm. Inside her, the horror hides behind the intimacy of embrace. She makes suffering symmetrical, sacred, almost holy. But the truth is more chaotic, less theatrical. In these real rooms, men drowned slowly in cold stone cells. Women were paraded through the streets in pillories, spat upon and stripped of name. Punishments were not secret, they were seen, they were lived. They were meant to restore order, not to provoke awe. Inquisition records speak plainly. Questioned under torture. Subject endured the water test. Confessed with reluctance. Sentence, penance, and branding. Each word dull, lifeless, mechanical, until you remember that each line was someone's last day of light. The Iron Maiden was never written here. Her metal kiss was never recorded, but her silence echoes louder than the truth. Because we need her more than they did. We invented her to reflect our fear that cruelty can be hidden behind beauty, that the worst suffering can come in the arms of something that promises mercy. She is the violation of sanctuary, the betrayal of maternal form. And so she walks into our nightmares, whispering that truth has no comfort. But history disagrees. History tells us that real pain wore no mask, that real justice was brutal but visible, and that myths like the Maiden let us hide from the uglier truth, that suffering is often less symbolic and more bureaucratic. The candle flickers in the cell. The man still kneels. He is not dead yet. He will be taken upstairs soon, eyes half blind from darkness, knees trembling. There is still hope. A confession could save his soul, even if it condemns his body. He hears footsteps, leather on stone. The Inquisitor approaches. No spikes, no iron shell, only questions, only the long ritual of pain, recorded by ink and blessed by Rome. As the door opens, the candle dies, and we turn from this room. Not because the story ends, but because it deepens. The Iron Maiden is not here. She waits elsewhere, in glass cases, in wax museums, in schoolbooks and horror films. She waits in our hunger for spectacle, for the grotesque. But in doing so, she steals our attention from the voices that really mattered. Voices like his. The man who knelt, the woman who screamed, the child who saw his father taken. Their pain was real, their names forgotten, their trials documented, if only in the margins of parchment, now yellowed by centuries of silence. And so we leave the myth behind, not discarded, but acknowledged for what it is. An echo of misunderstanding, a symbol too perfect to be true. The next chamber lies ahead. There is more pain to uncover, but also more truth. Not theatrical, not adorned in spikes, but raw, lived, feared. The next story waits, and it too demands to be heard. It begins not with a scream, but with a silence too loud to ignore. A silence thick as wool, soaked in rain and reverence. The kind that settles when a punishment is about to be seen, not heard. The wind howls against the stone arches of a late medieval prison in France, but inside all is still. In the corner of the chamber stands a figure not of iron, but of shame, wide, cumbersome, impossible to escape. It is not sharp, it is not spiked, it is the Schandmantel, the coat of humiliation. Straw litters the floor, damp and mold-soft. A rat rustles past, unnoticed. A guard dozes beneath a lantern, snoring lightly as the smoke curls toward the ceiling. In the center of the room, a man stands, trembling, locked into a wooden barrel lined with filth. His arms protrude like broken branches. His eyes are hollow from a sleepless night. He has not been tortured in body, but in dignity. This was punishment. This was power. There is no Iron Maiden here. Only the weight of eyes, jeering villagers, stone-hearted magistrates, the indifferent priests who watched and whispered, "It is justice." The coat of shame was meant not to maim, but to erase, to turn a man into mockery, and in that erasure to warn others what awaited those who defied the balance of town and church. Yet centuries later we would forget this. We would trade truth for terror, humiliation for horror, cloth for iron. The narrator's voice deepens, reflective, sorrowful. Somewhere in a wax-lit exhibition hall in the 19th century, the Iron Maiden opened her jaws for the first time. Or so they said. Her bolts creaked with theatrical menace. Her spikes gleamed beneath polished lanterns. She was not found, but built, from pieces of older torture tools, assembled in spectacle, christened by myth. She never shamed. She devoured. Tourists watched in breathless awe. Mothers clutched their children. Scholars frowned, but said nothing. And in the hush of belief, the truth was buried beneath the clang of iron hinges and the thrill of imagined cruelty. The Schandmantel, real, documented, used, was too simple, too quiet. The world wanted a monster, so it made one. We are told the Iron Maiden came from Nuremberg, but Nuremberg's records speak only of legal codes, fines, public floggings, harsh but measured. There is no mention of a steel sarcophagus filled with spikes. No name given to a device shaped like a sainted virgin turned executioner. The first whispers of her existence arise not in parchment, but in ink, scribbled centuries later in German philosophical texts, Victorian guidebooks, and exhibition pamphlets sold to eager hands. She was forged, yes, but not in flame, in fantasy. We return now to that French prison. The man inside the barrel has fallen to his knees. His tears mingle with the straw. A young girl passes by the barred window and dares a glance. Her mother pulls her away. "Don't look," she says. But the girl does. She always will. And that is the point, to be seen. Medieval punishment was ritualized, made public, designed to correct, not simply to punish, but to remind. The whip, the stocks, the shame masks, all real. All survived in court records and woodcut illustrations. They were tools of order, not legend. They needed no embellishment. And yet we look back and demand more. We crave the drama, the gore, the grotesque made beautiful. The Iron Maiden gave us that, a body-shaped tomb of torment, artful in her violence, perfect in her cruelty. So perfect she could only have been a lie. And still, we worship her image, because she asks no questions. She confirms what we already believe, that the past was worse, that we are better. that their pain was barbaric and ours somehow more civilized. She stands like a totem in every museum, her arms outstretched not to punish, but to reassure. Look, she says, you have come so far, but beneath that reassurance is an insult to history, to the truth, to the real men and women who suffered in quieter ways, who stood in barrels, who were whipped in marketplaces, who wore iron collars for months, their necks bloodied by rust and rain. Their suffering had no spikes, but it left scars just the same. The narrator's voice slows, the tone turning gentle. Somewhere, a curator closes the museum for the night. She pauses before the maiden. Her reflection wavers in the polished iron. The room is empty. And for a moment, she wonders, not if it was used, but why it had to be believed. There are other artifacts here. Forgotten tools, collars, branding irons, scrolls of confession. But none attract like the maiden. She is a spectacle, a story too sharp to ignore. And yet the truth waits, silent, in the next room. Let us go there. Not for thrill, not for horror, but for the quiet truths that still whisper beneath the dust. What we find next may not look like cruelty, but it was, and it shaped the lives of thousands, not in a single scream, but in years of silence. Let us leave the maiden. Let her stand in the shadow she cast. Ahead, the deeper story begins, not in forged iron, but in real flesh. And the next chapter is waiting. The door groaned as it closed, not with the finality of a prison cell, but with the hollow weight of a theater curtain falling after the last act. The torch in the corridor sputtered, casting frantic shadows that reached across the stone like fingers trying to escape. Behind the iron door, only emptiness remained. No blood, no bones, no screams, just the shape of something once believed. The Iron Maiden, silent, towering, hollow. This is how myths die, not with flames, not with confession, but in the quiet realization that no one is watching anymore. The Iron Maiden had never belonged in the medieval world she was said to haunt. No records, no verdicts, no victims. And yet, for centuries, she stood at the center of our darkest visions of the past. A feminine sarcophagus, her embrace lined with iron thorns, waiting not to cradle but to consume. But what did she consume, really? Truth. The torchlight flickers lower. Dust settles like old ash on the floor, stirred only by the breath of memory. And in that breath we return, not to the iron sarcophagus, but to the rooms she claimed as her stage. Rooms where real people suffered, but never in her arms. It is 1532. The air is damp with fear and parchment. The Constitutio Criminalis Carolina has just been inked into law across the Holy Roman Empire. It is precise, cold, and bureaucratic, detailing exactly how and when torture may be used. A rope, a flame, a rack, always recorded, always supervised, always justified in writing. There are no entries for spiked coffins, no rituals of being shut alive in steel wombs. Pain was real, but its instruments were known, named, and grimly catalogued. The narrator slows, so why then do we insist on her? On the Iron Maiden? Because myth gives shape to silence. Because we are drawn not to the truth, but to the story we want the past to tell. We want villains draped in black and instruments of agony born of twisted genius. We want the elegance of horror. And in the Maiden, we find her, death made divine. But there is nothing elegant about history. Real torture was not mythic, it was mundane. It happened in the low rooms beneath courtrooms, in view of notaries and priests. It happened under oil lamps, with wrists bound by coarse rope. The smell was not of burning incense, but of sweat and old wounds. Torture was structured suffering, calculated, exacting, cold, and yet less remembered, because it is harder to fear that which is small, procedural. Harder to feel dread for a man screaming on a rack than for a body swallowed whole by a silent, spiked tomb. The Iron Maiden offers us simplicity, villainy without nuance, pain without paperwork. But she is a lie. She was born not in dungeons, but in drawing rooms, not by inquisitors, but by curators and collectors. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the remains of older torture devices were welded together, polished, and reimagined as singular monstrosities. The Iron Maiden became centerpiece, idol, spectacle. In exhibitions across Europe and America, she drew crowds like a saint, draws pilgrims. They stared into her hollow chest, where spikes were placed just so, enough to pierce, but not kill, instantly. Slow, surgical, merciless. Visitors gasped. Children whispered. Some turned away, but few asked where she came from. In the flickering dark of spectacle, we suspended disbelief. We let ourselves believe the Middle Ages had created her, that she was born of that time, that faith, that fear. But it was not her time. She was a 19th century ghost wearing a medieval mask. Still, she endures, and that is her final cruelty. Even now, her replicas stand in museums and dungeons, their plaques uncertain, their origin stories frayed. Some still call her real, some still teach her legend, and in that space between history and hunger, her myth survives. But now, the door has closed. The light is fading, and still she does not bleed. The narrator's voice lowers to a hush as if walking through the last chamber of a mausoleum. The Iron Maiden was not real, but the pain she represented was. It just looked different, sounded different. It was in the shivering limbs of a heretic awaiting trial, in the broken fingers of a thief forced to sign confession, in the damp straw where prisoners lay, sick and faceless. Their stories were not sharp, they were not sculpted in steel, they were soft, fragile, human, and they were lost, because we looked away from them and into the mouth of a maiden who never fed. So what then remains? A door, a silence, a shadow on the wall, and the slow, aching understanding that myth, once believed, is harder to kill than truth ever was. But we can still choose. We can choose to turn from the spike-lined theater and step into the real pain, the real justice, the real memories of a world that did not need Iron Maidens to be cruel. As the torch dies in its sconce, the hallway before us darkens. But it is not empty. There are still echoes ahead, footsteps, breath, names. There are still stories to tell, not of devices, but of decisions, of systems, of the lives caught in their turning gears. Let us follow them now. Let us walk away from the maiden and toward the men and women history left behind. The light through the stained glass came soft and fractured, anointed in dust, diluted by centuries. It did not blaze like truth, it whispered. Colors drifted across the flagstones like old prayers, blue like bruises, gold like rot, red like sacrifice. This was not a dungeon. This was a courtroom. And justice, in the medieval world, began not with screams, but silence. The hall is still. High ceilings, carved oak beams, windows set deep into the stone. On the bench, a reeve adjusts his robes. His hands are calloused, fingertips stained with ink and wax. Below, a mother clutches the sleeve of her son, barely grown. A baker stands beside her, avoiding eye contact. The parchment beside the judge waits, blank, ready to absorb guilt in curling Latin script. There is no Iron Maiden here, no sound of creaking hinges, no whisper of steel. And yet the consequences that will follow this silence may last for generations. Because pain in this world did not always begin with iron. Sometimes it began with ink. The narrator's voice deepens, as if walking slowly down a cathedral aisle. Medieval punishment was as much about memory as it was about flesh. It was not only the tool, but the record, the stain that outlived the scar. When a man was accused, it was not the device that first touched him, but the page, the record of accusation, the ledger of confession, the judgment sealed and filed in the cathedral archives like bones beneath altar stone. And it is here, in these forgotten papers, that the truth of the Middle Ages lives, not in the Iron Maiden, but in the system that never needed her. Because torture, real torture, was ritualized, controlled, church-approved. It had a shape and a reason, etched into legal codes like the Carolina, and in the ecclesiastical manuals of inquisitors from Avignon to Mainz. It was a performance, yes, but of procedure, not myth. The maiden had no place in this script. Her metal kiss, her narrow spine, her symmetrical spikes, none of them belonged in the world of real pain. She was too beautiful, too cinematic, too late. We drift now to another room, smaller, lit by candles set into iron sconces, the wax pooling like melted time. A clerk copies yesterday's confessions. His quill scratches like footsteps in the dark. The parchment smells of mold and lamb fat. And outside, the bell of the monastery tolls nuns. The Iron Maiden did not belong in these halls either. Her story, you see, was born not of medieval discipline, but of modern guilt. It arrived centuries later, wearing a mask of antiquity, stepping out from behind velvet curtains at exhibitions and fairgrounds. She was not built for punishment, she was built for performance. A reminder not of what they did, but of what we fear we could do. She became a symbol because she was easy. Her shape was clean, her narrative closed. One device, one victim, one moment of death. But real punishment was messier. A girl accused of theft might be branded, might be banished, might be fined beyond what her family could ever repay. Her sentence may not have drawn blood, but it could drown generations in debt and shame. A priest suspected of heresy might spend years in spiritual exile, his soul crushed under the silence of suspicion. His children would not marry. His name would not pass on. No maiden was needed for this kind of pain. Only bureaucracy. The narrator's tone grows softer, reverent, and so we must ask, why do we still stand before her? Why do museum goers hush when they see her? Why do filmmakers choose her? Why do students remember her name when they forget the laws that governed real medieval justice? Because she is a myth we made for ourselves, a lie with edges, a fable with form. But beyond her, beyond the rivets and rust and falsehood, lies a greater truth. The people of the Middle Ages did not need her to hurt each other, and they did not invent her to remember pain. We did. We built her to reflect our fear of power without mercy, to make flesh our suspicion that beauty can hide cruelty, that a system can smile and still destroy. The Iron Maiden is not medieval. She is modern, a symbol not of what we escaped, but what we still carry. And yet, there is grace in letting her go. Because when we release her, we make space for the quieter stories. For the child who watched his father whipped at the market cross, for the midwife accused of charms she never spoke, for the peasant who starved in the pillory while the town walked past. These were the real punishments. This was the real cruelty. Not spectacle, but slow erasure. The light through the stained glass begins to fade now. Evening falls like ash. The courtroom is empty again, the parchment filed away, the ink dried to silence. And still, there is more to uncover. Not in the myths we've built, but in the echoes we've ignored. The next chamber waits, not darker, but deeper. No Iron Maidens there, just names, just choices, just a history more painful and more human than fiction ever dared to be. Let us descend.